What I want to talk to you about then is how the story of the civil rights movement gets told. What characters are put in the story for us? When does that story begin and end? What are the points of view from which the story is told? And what are the morals that we're supposed to take from the story? And part of the reason I want to get you to think about this, and you started a little bit with Brown, is because I think we're living in a society that is telling us the story of the civil rights movement in a very limited way. In a way that in certain ways doesn't empower people, but might actually disempower. And that's what I want to talk about. Let me tell you a little bit about Ella Baker. Ella Baker was one of these people who came out of the sort of left-wing politics of the 1930s. She was here in Harlem in the 1930s. Was an activist in the 40s, became a field secretary for the NAACP. Again, the civil rights movement doesn't start in 1954 or 5. Traveled around the South organizing branches of the NAACP. Later, after the Montgomery bus boycott, became the executive secretary of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King's organization. She was very unhappy in both the NAACP and in the SCLC. In part, she was unhappy because of sexism. But she was also unhappy because she felt like these movements were in fact leading people astray. Because what they were involved with was teaching people to follow leaders. And that in fact you didn't empower people by teaching them to follow. You empowered them by teaching them to lead. And that everyone had in them the capacity to lead. But you had to have, and everyone in them didn't, you didn't just roll into town and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Actually, if you had patience and time, you could actually tap into that knowledge that people had of their own communities and build it and nurture it slowly so that when Martin Luther King rolls into town, everyone has a big rally, then he leaves and there's nothing left behind. That wouldn't happen anymore. That what you would do is leave in place people who were capable of sustaining a struggle. That became the philosophy of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Ella Baker was the patron saint of SNCC. SNCC worked all over the South. It worked particularly in Mississippi. The philosophy of SNCC was that activists would go in, not with these huge media events, no television cameras, no Martin Luther King, in ones and twos, and they would go live in towns, and they would stay, and they would very slowly get to know people, talk to people, try to show people, find out who those people in the community who had some leadership possibilities were, and nurture that. In the summer of 1964, SNCC put out a call to colleges across the country, white and black colleges, to have students come south and work in Mississippi for the summer. This would give them foot soldiers. They also reckoned if students came from places like Yale and Stanford and Columbia, as well as Howard, and if some of those students got beat up, got murdered, maybe the nation would pay attention when it wasn't paying attention to what was happening to black activists in Mississippi. And that, in fact, is the story of Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner and James Chaney. The most important SNCC activist doing this first in Mississippi, the one who sort of broke fresh ground, was a guy named Bob Moses. I'll tell you two stories about two women. One is Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer was illiterate, worked on a plantation in Ruleville, Mississippi. When SNCC activists came to Ruleville, they said, you have the right to register to vote. She didn't know that black people had the right to register to vote. But the next day, she went down to the courthouse and tried to register. Now, of course, she didn't succeed. In fact, the Mississippi legislature enacted a law that if a person tried to register, for the next 2 weeks, The names of all people attempting to register would be printed in the local paper. What was that about?
Scare them.
Yeah. That meant that the bank called in your mortgage, your father who was teaching at the local school got fired, your mother who was a domestic worker got fired, you lost credit at the grocery store, it might have meant that your house got burned down. That's how it worked. Fannie Lou Hamer went that night. The plantation owner told her she either had to withdraw her registration or leave the plantation. She left the plantation. By 1964, Mrs. Hamer was one of the most important leaders of an organization called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She, in fact, at the Democratic Convention in 1964, was testifying to the Credentials Committee about her experiences, and it was so powerful, this woman that no one would have ever heard of 2 years before, that the President of the United States, who was desperate to get her off because he didn't want people to hear this story, called a press conference, just so the television cameras had to break from Mrs. Hamer and go to the White House.